The morning Julia Brenner discovered her strongbox missing, the whole town of Caldera Creek felt the silence of it, the way a held breath feels before something irreversible happens. She had built everything from nothing. That was the part that made the loss so profound, so brutal in its reach. Julia had come to Caldera Creek in the spring of 1882, arriving on the westbound stage with a carpetbag in one hand and a deed to a piece of dried-out land in the other. And she had worked that land and the small mercantile she opened beside it with every ounce of strength her 26-year-old body possessed. She had mixed her own mortar, painted her own sign, ordered supplies on credit she barely had the means to cover, and slowly, painfully, she had built herself a life on the sun-baked plains of eastern New Mexico territory. The strongbox had held $432, every cent she owned. She discovered it gone on the morning of October the 4th. She had gone to the back room of the mercantile where she kept it locked beneath a false floorboard, and she found the board splintered, the box wrenched open and cast aside like it was nothing more than an empty tobacco tin. The lock was destroyed. The money was gone. Her receipt books were scattered, the back door hanging open on one hinge, and boot prints, a single set, narrow-heeled, deep in the left, led away from the back of the building toward the livery at the edge of town. She stood in that back room for a long moment. She did not cry. She had cried herself dry years before, long before she ever arrived in New Mexico territory, and she had made herself a promise after that. She would not cry over things that could be fixed. She would fix them instead. What she did not know yet was that the man who robbed her was a drifter named Cal Rourke, and that he had already been riding north for 4 hours before she ever opened her eyes that morning. What she also did not know was that a man named Vernon Underwood had been watching from the window of the hotel across the street when Cal Rourke slipped out of the alley behind her mercantile in the dark hours before dawn, saddled up at the livery, and rode out without a word to anyone. Vernon was not a man who explained himself easily or often. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, lean everywhere else, with dark hair that had grown a little too long at the back of his collar, and eyes so deep a gray they looked almost silver when the light hit them a certain way. He had been a deputy marshal out of Santa Fe for 4 years before something had happened that he did not like to speak about, and now he worked as a tracker, an independent man who followed trails for sheriffs, cattle outfits, and occasionally private individuals who had exhausted every other option. He was very good at it. He was perhaps the best in the territory, not because he was arrogant about it, but because he was patient and methodical, and he had never once in his professional life stopped a trail simply because it got difficult. He had come to Caldera Creek because he was passing through, nothing more. He had a job waiting in Colorado, but it did not begin for another 2 weeks, and the stage had a busted wheel axle that needed replacing. And so he had taken a room at the Emerson Hotel and was sleeping off a week of hard riding when the sound of a horse leaving the livery before sunrise pulled him out of a light sleep and sent him to the window on instinct. He could not say why he watched. He just did, because that was the kind of man he was. He noticed things, filed them away, and waited to see what they meant. He saw the man come out of the alley. He saw the man was moving fast but quiet. He saw the shape of something tucked under the man's coat that moved with a weight that did not belong to anything ordinarily worn. He filed it away and went back to sleep. In the morning, when the sound of Julia Brenner's voice cutting through the street woke him for good, he dressed and went down to see what had happened. And what he found was a woman standing in the doorway of the mercantile with her arms folded across her chest, and her jaw set so hard it looked like it could break stone, telling Sheriff Harlan Prout exactly what she had found and exactly what she expected to be done about it. Sheriff Prout was 62 years old and had a bad hip and a tendency to reach for reasons why things could not be done rather than reasons why they could. He listened to Julia with his hat in his hands, and his expression that of a man who was already writing a letter of apology in his head. "Miss Brenner," he said. "I will send a wire to the county seat and ask for assistance from the marshal's office. But I have to be honest with you. A single drifter moving fast on open range, well, that trail gets cold awful quick." "Then I suggest you start moving faster than the trail," Julia said. "I am not in a position to leave the town unprotected to pursue one man across open country." "Then I suggest you find someone who is." That was when Vernon stepped in. He had been standing at the edge of the small crowd that had gathered: the blacksmith, the banker, the woman who ran the laundry, 3 ranchers who happened to be in town for supplies, and he moved through them without hurrying, and he stopped in front of Julia Brenner and tipped his hat. "My name is Vernon Underwood," he said. "I do tracking work, independent of any office. I saw the man leave your building this morning before sunrise. I can describe him and I can follow the trail he left. I will do it for a fee, or I will do it for expenses and a percentage of whatever I recover. That is your choice." Julia looked at him. She was a striking woman, not in any conventional way that Caldera Creek would have recognized, but in the way that something forged under pressure is striking. She had a directness to her that was almost physical, a quality of attention that made you feel seen right down to the marrow. Her hair was dark red and pinned back severely. Her eyes were the color of amber lit from behind. She was wearing her work apron, and she had flour on her left wrist from the morning bread she had apparently been making when she discovered the loss, and she looked at Vernon Underwood with those amber eyes, and she took his measure in about 4 seconds flat. "What percentage?" she asked. 10, 5, 7.5. "Done," she said. "Get started." He liked her immediately. The trail went north as he had expected. Cal Rourke rode a horse with a chipped left rear shoe. Vernon found it in the livery dirt, confirmed it with the livery keeper, and found the mark again in the soft earth at the edge of town where the road dissolved into open range. The hoofprints moved at a steady canter heading northwest, which meant Rourke was not panicking, which meant he had either done this before or was confident he was not being followed. Vernon went back to the hotel, packed his saddlebags with efficient speed, settled his bill, and took his horse, a big roan gelding named August, who had carried him through worse country than this, from the livery. He was ready to ride within 20 minutes of his conversation with Julia, and he was already in the saddle when she appeared at the livery door. "I want to come," she said. "No, it is my money." "It is," he agreed. "And the man who took it is a day ahead of me, which means I cannot afford to ride at a pace suited to someone who is not accustomed to hard trail. No offense intended." "I ride as well as any man in this county," Julia said, and the way she said it left no room for argument on that particular point. Vernon studied her. "It is not safe," he said. "My entire life savings are riding northwest on a chipped left shoe. Safety is a luxury I cannot currently afford." She met his eyes and held them. "I will not slow you down. I will do as you say on the trail. I will not argue tactical decisions. I am asking to come because this is my money and my business, and I have the right to be present when it is recovered." He considered this for a long moment. Then he said, "Can you be ready in 10 minutes? "I have been ready since I found the floor pried up," she said. She rode a gray mare named Cisco, who was not as large as August but was quick and steady, and she wore practical clothes, a split riding skirt and a dark wool jacket and good boots, and she sat the saddle like she had been born to it. Vernon said nothing about this, but he noted it, the way he noted everything, and filed it in the place where important things were kept. They rode northwest through the rest of that morning and into the afternoon, through country that went from the scrubby flatlands around Caldera Creek to rolling hill grassland cut by dry creek beds and stands of piñon pine. The sky was enormous and blue and entirely indifferent. Vernon kept his eyes on the ground and spoke very little, but when he did speak, it was to name landmarks or point out markers in the trail, small things like a bent tuft of grass or a stone turned over by a passing hoof. Julia watched him work with something that was not quite admiration but was certainly attention. She had met skilled men before, and she understood the difference between a man who was skilled and a man who was merely confident, and Vernon was the former with so little of the latter that it was almost remarkable. He did not announce his methods or explain his deductions. He simply tracked, steady and silent, and the trail grew clearer in front of them as the miles passed. "He is moving toward Santa Rosa," Vernon said in the late afternoon, after studying a set of prints that crossed a dry arroyo. "He will stop there for the night or push on to Tucumcari. Either way, we will reach Santa Rosa tomorrow if we ride hard." "Then we ride hard," Julia said. They made camp that night in a hollow sheltered from the wind by a limestone ledge, and Vernon made a small fire and heated coffee and hardtack, and they ate in the kind of silence that was not uncomfortable so much as cautious, both of them feeling the edges of the other person the way you do when you find yourself unexpectedly close to someone who is not yet familiar. "You were a lawman," Julia said. It was not quite a question. Vernon looked at her over the rim of his coffee tin. "Yes. What happened?" He was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled and sent sparks up into the dark. "A man I was transporting to trial escaped my custody. He hurt someone before I caught him again. I handed in my badge because I felt the responsibility was mine, even though no formal blame was assigned." He said this flatly, without drama, as though it were a fact about the weather. But his jaw was set in a way that told her there was considerably more to it than that. "And the person who was hurt?" Julia asked. "She recovered fully." A pause. "She was a 12-year-old girl who happened to be in the wrong town. Her name was Mercy Alcott. She is fine now. She lives in Albuquerque with her family. I know because I checked. Twice a year I check." Julia looked at him across the fire for a long moment. "That is not the action of a careless man," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is the action of a man who cannot let things go. Perhaps that is useful in your current line of work." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but the suggestion of one. "It has its applications." Julia pulled her blanket up and looked at the fire. "I came to New Mexico Territory because my husband died," she said, and she was not sure why she said it except that the darkness and the firelight and the strangeness of the day had loosened something that was usually kept tight. 3 years ago. Fever. He left me with debts and a small insurance payment and nothing else. I decided I did not want to stay in Missouri where everything reminded me of what I no longer had, so I bought that land and I came west and I built that store." She paused. "That money was not just money. It was 3 years of my life pressed into a box." Vernon said, "I know," and the way he said it was so simple and so direct that she understood he actually did. They did not speak much after that, but when Julia woke in the gray hour before sunrise and found the fire rebuilt and Vernon sitting quietly with his coffee, watching the eastern horizon for the first trace of light, she felt something shift in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. Santa Rosa was a town of perhaps 300 people straddling the Pecos River, and they reached it by early afternoon of the second day. Vernon went to the saloon first, not to drink, but because saloons were where information pooled like water in a depression, and the bartender, a heavy-set man named Walt with a walrus mustache, knew every face that passed through. "A man with a narrow-billed brown hat moves quiet," Vernon described. "Rides a gray-brown gelding with a chipped left rear shoe. Would have come through last night or this morning." Walt considered. "Passed through last night, yeah. Took a room at Ma Horton's boarding house. Left this morning. Didn't say where he was going, but he asked me the fastest road north." North meant Tucumcari. From Tucumcari, a man could go a dozen directions: east into Texas, north into the Colorado Territory, west across the upper range. The trail would branch and spread and become harder the longer it stretched. Vernon bought information from a ranch hand who had seen a man matching the description leaving Santa Rosa on the northern road, and they were back in the saddle within the hour, Julia following without complaint, without question, holding the pace Vernon set without any sign of weakening. He watched her from the corner of his eye as they rode, and what he saw was a woman who was angry in the most productive possible way, not the kind of anger that made people reckless, but the kind that made them sharp. She was focused entirely on what lay ahead, and the beauty of her face in the afternoon light was something he tried not to look at directly, the way you try not to look directly at the sun, because it made it harder to think clearly, and thinking clearly was currently his most important function. Tucumcari greeted them with a dust storm arriving from the west, the kind that turned the sky the color of a dirty copper penny, and turned the air into something you had to chew before you could breathe. They arrived with bandanas over their faces and grit in every crease of their clothing, and Vernon went immediately to the marshal's office, because a marshal's office in a town of this size would have records of recent arrivals and recent trouble. The marshal of Tucumcari was a young man named DeWitt Colby, perhaps 25, with a freshly pressed shirt and the expression of someone who was determined to be competent. He listened to Vernon's account with his hands folded on his desk. "We had a disturbance at the rail station this morning," DeWitt said. "A man matching that description had a dispute with the ticket agent about pricing on a coach to Trinidad, Colorado. We sorted it out without any arrests, but I got his name. He called himself George Barris." "That is likely false," Vernon said. "Very likely, but the name he put in the ledger is George Barris, and if he bought a ticket to Trinidad, Colorado, that is where the train was going." Trinidad, Colorado. That was a good 200 miles north, beyond the Raton Pass through the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Vernon thanked DeWitt Colby, and they went back out into the dust-stained street, and Julia stood beside her gray mare with one hand over her eyes against the blowing grit, and she said, "Colorado." "Colorado," Vernon confirmed. She absorbed this without visible distress. "How far behind are we?" "If he took the morning train, 6 hours. If we ride north and catch the evening train from Tucumcari, we can make up most of that time." "Then let us get our tickets," she said. He found himself smiling at her back as she walked toward the station, and he pulled the smile back before she could turn and see it, because smiling at a woman whose money had been stolen felt inappropriate, and also because the feeling that had prompted the smile was something he did not yet want to look at too directly. The train north to Trinidad ran through the Raton Pass and arrived in the Colorado coal town by the following morning. They slept in separate cars, Julia in the ladies' car, Vernon in the general passenger car, and Vernon spent most of that night at the window watching the dark pass and thinking about trails and the ways they narrowed. Cal Rourke, or George Barris as he was apparently calling himself, had a day's head start in a town Vernon did not know. But Vernon knew trails, and a man spending money he had just stolen moves in particular ways. He buys comfort, he drinks, he breathes out. The hotels would see him, the saloons would see him, and Vernon would see what the hotels and saloons had seen. Trinidad in the fall of 1882 was a coal town living on the edge of a boom, full of miners and railroad men and the commerce that followed both. The streets were busier than anything back in New Mexico territory, the buildings taller and newer, and the smell of coal dust was a constant presence. Vernon and Julia stepped off the train into the cold mountain air of a Colorado morning and immediately felt the change in altitude in their lungs. Vernon had contacts in Trinidad. He had done a job here 2 years prior, tracking a stolen remuda for a local ranching outfit, and the man who had hired him, an older rancher named Corcoran, had connections throughout the county. Vernon sent a wire to Corcoran's ranch from the telegraph office and got a reply within 40 minutes. The reply said, "Man answering your description showed up at the Silver Pick Saloon 2 nights ago, has a room at the Douglas Hotel, has been spending freely." Vernon showed Julia the wire and watched her expression cycle through relief, anger, and something harder and more resolute in about 3 seconds. "He is still here," she said, "for now. Then we go." "We go to the marshal's office first," Vernon said. "I will not walk into this without proper authority established. I was a deputy marshal. I know how these things go wrong when a man acts without jurisdiction." Julia looked like she wanted to argue. Then she closed her mouth and nodded once. The Trinidad City Marshal was a man named Ezra Holland, a solid and unimpressed individual in his mid-40s who had clearly heard every possible variation of every possible story. Vernon presented his identification and his record as a licensed tracker, explained the situation with efficient clarity, and Ezra Holland leaned back in his chair and looked at Julia. "You have documentation for the strongbox?" he asked her. Julia opened her jacket and produced, from an inner pocket, a folded paper that proved to be the insurance document for the strongbox, listing its contents and her name as the owner. Ezra Holland looked at this and raised an eyebrow. "You carried insurance documentation on your person into the wilderness," Vernon said to her quietly. "I carry everything important on my person," she said, with a look that suggested she had learned this lesson from experience. "Always." Ezra Holland stamped a piece of paper and handed it to Vernon. "This authorizes you to act in a supporting capacity to my office in the recovery of stolen property belonging to Miss Brenner. I will send Deputy Ackerman with you. The man is not to be harmed unless he presents a direct threat. The money is to be recovered and inventoried before it leaves my building." He looked at Julia again. "That means you will get your money back in proper order, Miss Brenner, with my office as a witness to the transaction." "That is perfectly acceptable," Julia said. The Douglas Hotel was a 3-story building on Commercial Street, with a lobby that smelled of wood smoke and cooked meat, and the desk clerk was a nervous young man who confirmed, with a bit of gentle pressure from Deputy Ackerman's badge, that a man calling himself George Barris was indeed in room 14 on the 2nd floor, and that he had ordered supper brought up the evening before and had not checked out. Vernon was the one who knocked on the door, because he understood the psychology of these situations better than a young deputy or a rightfully furious woman. He knocked twice, said, "Hotel staff, sir, here with your laundry." And when the door opened 6 inches with the chain still engaged, he put his shoulder against it and popped the chain with one clean push. Cal Rourke was not a large or impressive man. He was lean and pale with a receding hairline and a patchy beard, and he had been sitting on the bed counting money that was spread across the coverlet in loose piles. And when the door came open, he scrambled backward toward the window before Deputy Ackerman's voice stopped him cold. The money was mostly intact. They counted it right there in room 14 with Rourke sitting in the corner looking at his boots. $398. $34 was missing, presumably spent on the train ticket and the 2 nights at the hotel, and whatever he had been drinking at the Silver Pick Saloon. $398, Julia said, looking at the stacked bills in Vernon's hand. Her voice was very controlled. 432 less 34 is 398, so I am missing $34. Mr. Rourke will be accounting for that difference to the territory of Colorado, Ezra Holland said when they brought Rourke to his office, along with the full story from Vernon's account and a signed statement from Julia. Rourke said almost nothing throughout this process. He appeared to have already calculated his odds and found them poor. Julia signed her statement and accepted a receipt for the $398 from Marshal Holland, and she folded that receipt carefully and put it in her inner pocket beside her insurance document. And then she walked out of the marshal's office onto Commercial Street in Trinidad, Colorado. And she stood in the cold autumn air with the mountains enormous and white-tipped above the town. And for the first time since she had found her floor pried open 3 mornings ago, she let out a long, slow breath. Vernon came out behind her. He stood beside her not too close and looked at the mountains. "It is done," he said. "Nearly," she said. "I still owe you 7.5% of $432. You owe me 7.5% of what was recovered," he said, "which is $398. That is $29.85. You are shortchanging yourself. A contract applies to what is delivered," he said. She turned and looked at him, really looked at him, the way she had that first morning in Caldera Creek, only now the looking was different because she knew things about him she had not known then. She knew about Mercy Alcott and the badge he had handed in. She knew how he slept lightly with his hand near his gun and his boots still on. She knew that he rebuilt fires in the dark so she would not wake to cold. She knew that he talked to his horse in a low, steady voice during hard stretches of trail as though the animal were a colleague deserving of explanation. "Have dinner with me," she said. He looked at her with those silver-gray eyes. "Miss Brenner, we are two people who have spent 3 days riding hard through 2 territories and into a third, and I am hungry, and I would like to eat supper with another human being at a proper table. That is all I am suggesting." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." They ate at a restaurant on Main Street that served a proper meal: beef roast and potatoes and bread and coffee. And the restaurant had a tin ceiling and real glass in the windows, and a fire going in a stone hearth. And after 3 days of trail food, it felt extraordinary. They ate in the manner of people who have been hungry for a while, with focus and appreciation. And then the food was cleared and the coffee refilled and the fire burned low, and they talked. They talked for 2 hours. Julia told him about Missouri, about her marriage to a man named Thomas Brenner who had been kind and steady and taken by pneumonia at 31, about the grief of that loss and the deeper grief of discovering that grief could not last forever and that the world required you to keep moving regardless. She told him about the decision to go west, the fear and the freedom of it, the particular dignity of building something with her own hands. Vernon told her about growing up in East Texas, about a father who was a justice of the peace and a mother who died young, about learning to track from an old Mexican vaquero named Ramiro, who had more patience than anyone Vernon had ever met before or since. He told her about the years as a deputy marshal, the things he had seen, the way a sense of order and justice had always felt important to him without being simple, because the frontier was not simple and justice out here was rarely clean. "You will go back to Colorado," Julia said. She was not asking. She had remembered the job he had mentioned the first morning, the one that had brought him to this territory. "Have a job here," he confirmed. "A ranching outfit near Pueblo that needs some horses traced. I expected to begin it in a week. And after that," he looked at her, "I do not typically plan past the next job. Is that a preference or a habit?" He considered this seriously, the way he considered most things. "Habit, probably. A man in my line does not do well putting roots down in one place, or so I have always told myself." "And has the telling yourself worked?" Julia asked. The fire in the hearth crackled. Outside, the streets of Trinidad were going quiet with the evening. Vernon's coffee was untouched and cooling. "Less well lately," he said, and the way he said it was quiet and careful and entirely honest. Julia looked down at her coffee cup and then back up at him. There was color in her face that was not from the fire. "I should get some rest," she said. "We have a long ride back." "We do," he agreed. But neither of them moved for another 20 minutes. And what they talked about in those 20 minutes was lighter, the funny story of how Julia had acquired Cisco the gray mare from a widow woman who had tried to sell her a mule, and Vernon's account of the time he had tracked a stolen piano across 40 miles of Texas Panhandle for a saloon owner who had then refused to pay on the grounds that the piano was out of tune when recovered. And they were both laughing by the end of it, easy and genuine. And the laughing felt like the most natural thing in the world. In the morning, they began the long ride back south. Vernon had sent word about the Pueblo job, explaining the delay and asking whether the start date could be pushed back 2 weeks, and he had received a reply that it could. And so he rode south with Julia without the pressure of a deadline, and the return journey was a different thing entirely from the outward chase. They were no longer pursuing. They moved at a more natural pace, stopping when the light was good to let the horses drink and graze, talking more easily than they had in the chase's urgency. They came back through Raton Pass as the first snow of the season was beginning to dust the high peaks, and the world was so enormous and cold and brilliant that Julia reined in her mare and just looked at it for a long moment. "I have never been in the mountains before this week," she said. "Never. Missouri is not mountainous country." She looked at the white peaks and the dark pines and the sky that was that particular deep blue you only get at altitude. It is very beautiful. I had not expected to find beauty in the middle of all this. Vernon was watching her, not the mountains. Yes, he said quietly, unexpected. She turned and caught him looking, and held his gaze for a beat too long, and then both of them turned back to the mountains with a careful deliberateness that was almost funny. They rode south through the long corridor between the mountains and the eastern plains, and they stopped in a small settlement called Springer for the night, and over supper in the settlement's one eating establishment, a dining room attached to a dry goods store, run by a large and cheerful woman named Mrs. Padilla, who fed them red chili stew and corn tortillas, and acted as though feeding trail-dusty strangers was the finest part of her day. Vernon told Julia something he had not planned to say. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what comes after this." Julia waited. "I have been doing this work for 3 years with no fixed address and no fixed plans, and I have told myself that suited me. But I have been thinking in the last few days that perhaps I have been confusing not wanting to be hurt again with not wanting to be anywhere." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Those are different things." Julia was very still. "What hurt you?" she asked. Not the Mercy Alcott situation, she already knew that. Something else, she could see it. He was quiet for a long moment. "A woman in Santa Fe several years ago. She left not because I did anything wrong and not because of the badge situation, but simply because she found that a man who was always riding away was not the kind of man she wanted. She was right to leave, but it settled in me in a particular way." He paused. "I think I decided that riding away would always be the thing I did, and so I made it a professional virtue. And now," Julia said, "and now I am sitting across a table from a woman who built a mercantile from scratch in the middle of the desert and chased her stolen money across 3 states and did not cry once that I saw. And I am finding that my professional virtue feels somewhat less convincing." He met her eyes directly. "I'm not saying anything that needs answering tonight. I'm just saying that I am aware of a thing that is happening." Julia looked at him for a long time. The red chili stew was cooling. Mrs. Padilla was humming to herself in the kitchen. "I am aware of it too," Julia said. "I have been trying not to be because it seems impractical. Most worthwhile things are. That is either wisdom or an excuse." "Probably some of both," he admitted. She smiled at him then, a real, full smile that reached her eyes, and the amber in those eyes lit up in the lamplight. And Vernon Underwood felt something settle in him the way a horse settles when it finally reaches water after a long dry stretch with complete and grateful conviction. They did not say anything more that evening that crossed the line from honesty into declaration. But the thing that had been hovering between them since that first morning in Caldera Creek had now been named, at least in approximate terms, and named things have a way of becoming more real. The last day of riding back into New Mexico territory brought them down out of the mountain foothills and into the high desert flats, and the landscape shifted back to that particular quality of light that the territory had golden and hard and clean, and Caldera Creek appeared on the horizon in the late afternoon of their 4th day returning, a cluster of buildings in the flat expanse, unremarkable to anyone who did not know what was there. And Julia felt the sight of it settle in her chest, with something that surprised her by feeling like home. She had been afraid before she left that coming back without her money might mean coming back to lose everything. The mercantile would have bills due, the credit she had been extended would be called in. But she was coming back with $398. Not everything she had lost, but enough. Enough to hold the business, to pay what was owed, to begin again from a position that was not ruin. Vernon rode in beside her, and she was aware of him without looking at him, the way you are aware of a fire in the room without looking directly at the fire. Sheriff Prout was in the street when they arrived, and his eyebrows went up with something that in a less self-contained man would have been surprise. "Miss Brenner," he said, "you are back." "As you see," she said. "And the money?" $398 recovered, Julia said. The thief is in the custody of the Trinidad, Colorado City Marshal, one Ezra Holland, to whom you may direct any official communication regarding the matter." She reached into her pocket and produced a card that Marshal Holland had given her. "Mr. Underwood recovered the property and I am settled with him." She glanced at Vernon. Nearly. Vernon was dismounting. He looked at her over his horse's back. "Come to the store tomorrow morning," she said to him. "I will have your fee ready." "There is no rush," he said. "There is," she said. "I want all my accounts to be in order." A pause. "And I want to make you breakfast." Vernon Underwood looked at her across the back of his horse with those silver-gray eyes, and something in his expression was open in a way that she thought it did not often open, and he said, "I will be there at 8. "Good," she said. And she rode Cisco toward the livery. The next morning came bright and cold, the way October mornings in New Mexico Territory do, the sky so blue it looked painted. Julia was up at 6 and had the mercantile opened and the back room cleaned, the broken floorboard replaced by a proper lockbox bolted to the wall, which she had arranged before she left, and the blacksmith had installed in her absence. And she had eggs and salt pork and fresh bread going on the small iron stove she kept in the back room for the cold months. Vernon arrived at 2 minutes to 8. He knocked on the back door, which she had told him to use, and she let him in, and the smell of the food hit him, and he stopped in the doorway just long enough to tell her what she needed to know about the state of him without either of them saying anything. They ate together at the small table in the back room. The food was good. The coffee was strong. Outside the windows the town was coming awake, the distant sound of hammers from the smithy and horses on the street, and the morning beginning itself all around them. Julia set his fee on the table beside his plate, $29.85 exact, and he looked at it, and then he pulled $4 back toward her. "The strongbox I pried out of the floor in Colorado," he said. "To see what had been spent, I damaged it. Those are replacement costs." She stared at him. "You are paying me out of your own fee. The job required it. The damage was mine to cover." "Vernon," she said, and this was the first time she had used his given name and both of them were aware of it. "I am not going to take $4 from you. It is a professional obligation. It is the most stubborn thing I have ever witnessed." She pushed the $4 back. "Take your money." He looked at her. "You are as stubborn as anyone I have ever met." "Then we are well matched," she said. The words hung in the morning air between them. Neither of them moved to take them back. The eggs were going cold. Vernon left the $4 on the table and picked up his coffee instead, and Julia did the same, and they sat in the morning quiet, and it was one of those moments that is itself a kind of declaration. "The Pueblo job," Vernon said eventually. "I have to ride up there within the week. How long will it take? 3 weeks, perhaps 4. And after that," he set down his coffee cup very carefully. "Julia," he said, and her name in his voice had a quality to it that she felt all the way down her spine. "I want to be very clear about what I am considering, because I am not a man who says things he does not mean." "I know that," she said. "I am considering whether Caldera Creek might be a reasonable base of operations for a man in my line of work, whether the territory is active enough to sustain the kind of work I do, whether there might be something worth returning to after a job that made the returning feel different from what it has previously felt like." He held her gaze. "Whether you might be open to seeing what develops between us when we are not racing across the landscape under press of emergency." Julia was very quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is the most carefully worded romantic expression I have ever heard." He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I am better at tracking than declarations." "You are extraordinary at tracking," she said, "and your declarations are not as poor as you think." She reached across the table and touched the back of his hand just briefly, just the tips of her fingers, and she said, "Come back from Pueblo. We will see what develops." He turned his hand over and caught her fingers in his palm for one moment, just long enough, and then released them. "I will come back," he said. And she believed him in the way that you believe something not because you have been given a guarantee, but because you know the character of the person making the promise, and she had spent 5 days watching his character operate under pressure, and it was the most reliable thing she had encountered in a very long time. He left for Pueblo 3 days later, after helping her rehang the back door of the mercantile on properly fitted hinges, which had nothing to do with his professional obligations, and everything to do with the fact that he had noticed it was crooked and could not leave it that way. He rode out north on August in the early morning, and Julia watched from the doorway of her store, and the distance opened up between them with that particular quality of the western landscape that made every departure feel enormous. She went back inside and got to work. The weeks that followed were her normal life, which she had not felt in more than a week, and she was surprised by how the normal life had changed texture. The mercantile was the same, the shelves of dry goods and tools and fabric and medicine, the customers who came in with their wants and needs, the accounts to be balanced, and the orders to be placed. But she moved through it now with a quality of awareness that had something new in it, and when she thought about why, the answer was always Vernon. Not in the way of dependency or obsession, but in the way of someone who had been living in a house alone for a long time and had suddenly become aware of what the house would feel like with another person in it, and found the thought not frightening, but genuinely appealing in a way that felt like a window being opened. She wrote a letter to her sister back in Missouri, the first in several months, and she described the robbery and the recovery and the tracker named Vernon Underwood, and she used the word extraordinary 3 times in the letter and only noticed this on the 4th reading, by which point she decided to leave it as it was. Her sister wrote back in 2 weeks, "He sounds remarkable. For heaven's sake, Julia, do not let that one get away." She laughed at that, alone in the back room, and folded the letter and put it in her desk. The first letter from Vernon arrived in the 3rd week. It was not long. He was not, as he had freely admitted, a natural in declaratory modes of communication, but it was precise and warm in the way that all his communication was precise and warm. He had found the horses. The ranching outfit was satisfied. He expected to be done within 10 days. He had been thinking about the red chili stew they had eaten in Springer, and would she know how to make it because Mrs. Padilla had given him the impression the key was the dried chili pods, and he was wondering if those were available in Caldera Creek. She read this letter twice and then went to her shelves and checked her dried chili pod inventory, which was, as it happened, excellent. She wrote back, "The chili pods are available. Come back to Caldera Creek and I will make the stew." He arrived on the 2nd Saturday in November, 31 days after he had left, and Julia was measuring out flour behind the counter of the mercantile when the bell above the door rang, and she looked up and there he was, trail dusty and cold from the ride, his coat still damp from the drizzle that had followed him in from the north, and he took off his hat and held it in front of him, and looked at her across the mercantile with an expression that was the most open she had seen on his face. "The horses were recovered," he said. "The ranching outfit paid me. The trail north is cold and the trail home was considerably more pleasant." She set down her flour scoop. "Home," she said. "I noticed I used that word," he said. "I noticed too." They looked at each other across the width of the mercantile, past the shelves of canned goods and bolts of fabric and hanging tools, and the November light came through the front windows and lay across the wooden floor in long pale rectangles, and Julia Brenner came around the counter and walked toward him and he met her halfway. He was taller than she generally remembered. She had to tilt her chin to look at him directly. He smelled of cold air and horses and wood smoke, and he was looking at her with those silver-gray eyes as though she were the most important landmark he had ever tracked toward. "I want to court you properly," he said, "with whatever that means in Caldera Creek, Sunday dinners and conversation and all the things that happen between people who are deciding something." "That sounds very reasonable," she said. "And at the end of it, if things progress as I expect them to, I intend to ask you to marry me. I am telling you this up front because I believe in giving people the information they need to make decisions." Julia stared at him. Then she said, You are informing me in advance that you intend to propose to me. I thought it fair. Vernon, she said, and she was trying very hard not to smile. That is not how courtship typically works. I am aware of that, but I have established that I am not typical in my communication style, and I would rather be honest and awkward than smooth and misleading. She did smile then, she could not help it. It came up from somewhere deep and warm, and she said, I appreciate the directness. I always have. A pause. And for the record, I believe I will say yes when the time comes. Now it was him trying not to smile, and he did not entirely succeed. The courtship of Julia Brenner and Vernon Underwood was in some ways entirely conventional Sunday dinners and long evening conversations on the front porch of the Mercantile, rides out into the surrounding countryside on days when the weather allowed, a formal introduction to Caldera Creek's small social world that required Vernon to shake a great many hands and answer a great many questions about his intentions with the patience of a man who understood that this was the price of entry. Sheriff Prout watched the proceedings with something that might have been satisfaction. Mrs. Elmer, who ran the laundry and had appointed herself the town's social conscience, declared Vernon a serious man of evident character, and gave Julia her official approval with the gravity of a congressional vote. In other ways, the courtship was not conventional at all, because both Julia and Vernon were people who had moved through the world largely on their own terms and had developed the kind of genuine individuality that resists conventional forms. Their conversations were arguments as much as anything else. Not hostile arguments, but the vigorous kind where both people actually cared about the outcome, about ideas, and about how to live, and what mattered and why. Vernon had opinions about land use and water rights, and the treatment of the Navajo and Apache peoples who were being steadily pushed from their territories, and his opinions were not the comfortable ones, and Julia appreciated this because her own were similar, and she was used to being the most inconvenient person in any given room on these subjects. One evening in late November, sitting by the fire in the back room of the Mercantile with coffee and a board game that they had abandoned in favor of talking, Vernon said, I want to tell you something about the work I was doing that I have not told you. Julia set down her cup. When I was a deputy marshal, one of the things I witnessed regularly was the way the law operated differently depending on who was on which side of it. The law worked for some people and not for others, and I was part of a system that I believed in principle, but that I sometimes could not respect in practice. He spoke carefully, clearly. I handed in my badge not only because of the Mercy Alcott situation, but because I had been questioning for a year whether I could do more good inside that system or outside it, and the Mercy Alcott incident made me face the question I had been avoiding. I chose outside. He looked at her. I tell you this because I want you to know the full picture of who I am and what has made me that way. I am glad you did, she said. I have had similar arguments with myself about the world as it is and the world as it should be. She was quiet for a moment. I have had customers in my store, Apache families who come in from the reservation to trade, and the way this town treats them is something I have gone to considerable lengths to change within my own small sphere of influence, and made enemies over, and I would make the same enemies again. She met his eyes. So yes, I understand the conflict between a system and its application. He looked at her with an expression that was not surprise exactly, but was something adjacent to wonder. Julia, he said. Vernon, she replied. They were both smiling. He proposed to her on a Sunday afternoon in December, in the Mercantile after the dinner dishes had been cleared, and the town was quiet outside with the cold, and he did it the proper way. He had a ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band with a small garnet in a plain setting, and he asked her with genuine and undramatic sincerity, and she said yes before he had quite finished the sentence. And he slid the ring onto her finger, and they sat in the back room of the Mercantile in the December afternoon and held hands in the firelight, and it was nothing like the dramatic romances that circulated in the novels of the period, and it was entirely, completely right. They were married in February of 1883, on a Saturday when the weather was unexpectedly clear and almost warm, in the small church at the west end of Caldera Creek's Main Street. The wedding was attended by most of the town, including Sheriff Prout, who cried and was embarrassed about it, and Mrs. Elmer, who did not cry but who squeezed Julia's hand afterward with a firmness that conveyed everything she could not say. 2 ranchers from the county came in who had hired Vernon for work over the years and had developed what passed in his world for friendship. The preacher was a man named Reverend Solis, who had married Julia in Missouri years before and had since moved west himself, which made the occasion both surprising and somehow fitting, as though the world was arranging itself into a coherent story. Vernon wore his good coat and had clearly cut his hair, and there was still something in the line of his jaw that was watchful and careful, the tracker in him that never fully switched off. But when Julia came down the aisle toward him in her blue wool dress, not a proper wedding gown, but the finest thing she owned, and a color that made her eyes look extraordinary, every bit of that watchfulness dissolved into something open and unguarded that she had never seen on him before, and that she would think about for years afterward. That moment of him standing at the front of the church with everything down and nothing held back, just completely present and completely hers. They said their vows. The preacher pronounced them man and wife. Vernon Underwood kissed his wife in the small Caldera Creek church with the February sun coming through the plain glass windows, and the congregation making the sounds that congregations make at such moments. And Julia thought with great clarity, "This is the second beginning of my life, and this one feels like it was worth every mile of everything it took to get here." They settled into a life that was particular and good. Vernon built a proper addition to the back of the mercantile, a real living space with a bedroom and a kitchen and a sitting room, and he did the work himself over the spring months, consulting with the carpenter in town when the structural elements required expertise, and doing the finish work on his own. He was good with his hands in this way, patient and methodical, as he was patient and methodical about everything. Julia watched him work on the addition from the back door of the store and thought about how a man's character expresses itself in everything he does, and this man's expressed itself as reliability. He still took tracking jobs. This had been part of the discussion before they married. Julia had not expected or wanted him to stop the work that defined him, and Vernon had been clear that he would not take work that took him away for more than 3 weeks at a time, and that he would not pursue dangerous work without adequate preparation and authority in place. He kept both of those commitments. He rode out for jobs in the territory and occasionally into neighboring states, and he came back from every one of them, and the coming back was its own small ceremony every time. August in the livery, Vernon at the back door of the mercantile with whatever he had brought back, which was sometimes a newspaper from a distant town, and sometimes a particular kind of candy he knew she liked, and once was an absolutely bewildered horned lizard in his jacket pocket that he had found on the trail and knew would make her laugh. It did make her laugh. The mercantile grew. This was not accidental. Julia had specific and well-considered ideas about what she wanted the store to be, and she executed them with the same methodical energy she brought to everything. She expanded her fabric selection and brought in a seamstress to do alterations. She added a modest lending library of books that could be borrowed for a small deposit, which became unexpectedly popular with the ranch families who came in from the surrounding range and had children who were hungry for reading material. She negotiated better terms with her suppliers by organizing a cooperative purchasing arrangement with 3 other small merchants in the county, which saved everyone money, and which the larger merchant in Tucumcari was not pleased about but could do nothing to prevent. She had made peace with the loss of the $34. Cal Rourke had been sentenced to 2 years in the Colfax County Jail. The New Mexico Territory courts had jurisdiction since the crime occurred in the territory, and the $34 was a line item in the history of her life that she had absorbed and filed appropriately. The story she told about it, when she told it at all, was not the story of the theft. It was the story of the recovery. On the first anniversary of the robbery, October the 4th, 1883, Vernon brought her a small wrapped package at breakfast. Inside was a journal, the good kind with a leather cover and quality paper, and on the first page he had written in his careful, angular hand, "For recording the things that are built, not just the things that are lost." Julia read this and was quiet for a moment and then looked up at him. "You remembered the exact date," she said. "I remember everything," he said, with the simplicity of a man stating a fact. "Occupational habit." "Vernon," she said, "this is the most thoughtful thing anyone has given me." "I thought about it for 2 months," he said, "which is longer than it took to track across 3 states. She crossed the kitchen and kissed him, and the morning light came in through the new windows of their addition, and the smell of coffee was in the air, and outside Caldera Creek was waking up, and this was the life they had made, and it was exactly, precisely enough. Their first child was born in the summer of 1884, a boy. They named him Thomas Vernon Underwood, Thomas for Julia's first husband, who deserved to be remembered, and Vernon for his father, and the combination felt right to both of them, honoring what had come before while being entirely itself. Thomas was a round, cheerful infant with dark hair like his father and amber eyes exactly like his mother, and he arrived on a sweltering July afternoon, while Vernon paced the street outside with the kind of barely contained agitation that all his habitual composure could not quite suppress. Doc Meacham came out after 2 hours and found Vernon standing very still outside the mercantile back door and said, "You have a fine son, Mr. Underwood. Mother and child both healthy." And Vernon nodded once, twice, and then sat down on the back step with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, not distressed but overwhelmed, simply overwhelmed. Julia called for him from inside. He went in and found her propped on the pillow with the baby in the crook of her arm, tired beyond expression but lit from within with something he had no adequate word for, and she held Thomas up and said, "Come and meet your son." He sat beside her on the bed and looked at the baby for a long moment. Thomas blinked at him with those amber eyes very seriously. "He looks skeptical," Vernon said. "He is your son," Julia said. "Give him a week. He will start tracking things." Vernon laughed, a real, complete laugh, and Julia leaned her head against his shoulder, and Thomas made a small, authoritative sound, and the summer afternoon settled around the 3 of them in the back room of the Caldera Creek Mercantile like something permanent. Life continued to arrange itself in the manner of good lives, not without difficulty, but with the quality of being livable, of being genuinely one's own. Vernon took fewer long-distance jobs as Thomas grew from infant to toddler to a bright, observant little boy who had indeed inherited his father's tracking instinct in the sense that he noticed absolutely everything and let nothing pass without examination, which was both exhausting and extraordinary to watch. There were hard seasons, too, as there always are. A drought in the summer of 1885 hit the ranching country hard and reduced Julia's business significantly, and they ate carefully that winter and did not spend on anything that was not essential. Vernon picked up more local work, helping the cattle outfits identify strays, doing survey consulting for a land office that was processing homestead claims, which was work he did with strict attention to fairness, because he had seen what happened when surveyors did not. The hardship was real, but it did not shake the foundation of what they had built, because the foundation had been constructed with the knowledge that hard seasons come. In the spring of 1886, Julia discovered she was pregnant again. She told Vernon on a morning in April when the mercantile was briefly empty and the light was coming in golden, and she said simply, "There is going to be another one," and watched his expression open up the same way it had that first time, the way she never got tired of seeing. "When?" he asked. "November, I think." He stood up from the stool he had been sitting on. He had been fixing the mechanism of the cash register, a new acquisition that he had been at war with for 2 days, and he crossed the room and put his arms around her and held her, and she felt the steadiness of him. The bedrock quality of him that she had come to understand was not a performance but a fact about who he was. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said into his shoulder. "I am simply telling you." "I am very glad you told me," he said. Their second child arrived in November of 1886, a girl. They named her Clara Rose Underwood, and she was small and fierce from the first breath, with a set of lungs that could wake the entire street and a determination in her expression, from almost the first week that made both her parents laugh in the exhausted way of people who recognize themselves in an inconveniently small person. Thomas was 2 years old when Clara arrived, and he approached his sister with the cautious curiosity of a born investigator, examining her tiny hands and feet with scientific thoroughness and concluding, on about the third day, that she was acceptable. He brought her small objects from around the room: a button, a piece of cord, a wooden animal that Vernon had carved for him, as offerings or perhaps as tests, and Clara grasped them in her small fist with surprising force, and Thomas found this very satisfying. Vernon watched his children with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, and Julia watched him watching them, and what she saw in those moments was the complete unlocking of a man who had spent years telling himself he was best suited to solitude. He was not. He was profoundly, deeply suited to this, to these small people, to the dailiness of their needs and personalities, to the way Thomas ran to him at the back door every evening and told him in great detail everything that had happened in the day, to the way Clara, as she grew into a toddler, followed him around the addition and the workshop like a small, determined shadow, interested in everything he was doing. Caldera Creek changed over those years, as frontier towns do. The railroad extended toward them in 1887, a spur line that connected the town to the main line at Santa Rosa, and this changed the economics of the place in ways that were both positive and complicated. The mercantile benefited from easier supply access. New people arrived, some good, some less so. The character of the place shifted in the way that the character of all growing places shifts, gaining some things and losing others. Vernon's work changed too. As the territory became more settled, the wild tracking jobs became rarer, and the surveying and legal investigation work became more common, and he adapted to this without complaint because the underlying skill was the same: finding what was there, reading what had happened, making sense of things by looking carefully. He developed a professional relationship with the district court in Santa Fe, doing investigative work on land disputes and property claims, and this work was steady and respectable and paid well. Julia expanded the mercantile a second time in 1888, taking over the building next door when the previous occupant, a bootmaker, retired and moved to Albuquerque. She converted the space into what she called a general goods annex, which was a fine name for what was essentially a small department store in frontier terms. A place where you could buy dry goods and hardware and fabric and books, and have a cup of coffee while you decided, which was extremely radical by the standards of Caldera Creek, but which turned out to be exactly what people wanted. The coffee aspect was an idea that Vernon had brought back from his time in Trinidad, where he had seen a similar arrangement in the restaurant on Main Street, and he mentioned it so casually over supper one evening that it took Julia a full 2 days to realize where the idea had come from, and to trace it back to the meal they had eaten together after recovering her money, in the first hours of knowing each other as something more than tracker and client. And she thought about the long thread that connected that evening to this one, and felt the full richness of it. In the summer of 1889, they took a trip together that was the first actual trip, not a job, not a pursuit, not a transit between points, that either of them had taken since arriving in the territory. They left the children with Mrs. Elmer, who had by then become something like a grandmother to Thomas and Clara, and they rode south together toward the White Mountains and the country that neither of them had seen. They rode for a week, just the two of them and the horses, through country that was ancient and enormous and magnificent, through pine forests at high altitude and across desert flats where the rocks were the color of old blood, and the sky was so blue it hurt. And they talked and did not talk and simply were together in the way of people who have had years of practice at knowing each other. On the fourth evening, they camped beside a stream in a canyon that felt like it had not been visited in a very long time, and Vernon built a fire with the efficiency he had always had, and Julia cooked the supper they had brought with them, and afterward they lay on their bedrolls under the stars which at this altitude and distance from any settlement were so thick and clear that the sky looked almost white in places, and Julia said, "Do you remember what you said the first night we camped together? The very first night when we were chasing Rourke." "I remember everything," Vernon said. "I said I had a habit of not planning past the next job. And I asked if that was a preference or a habit, and I said probably a habit." She turned her head to look at him, his profile against the stars. "It was a habit," she said. "You broke it." He turned to look at her too. The firelight caught his eyes. "You made it easy to break." "I did not make anything easy for you," she said with dignity. "I argued with you about your fee in the first 5 minutes we spoke. That was charming. It was practical. Also charming." He reached out and took her hand in the dark, and they lay under the stars of the White Mountain country with their hands linked, and the stream ran cold and clear beside them, and the fire burned down, and the night was completely quiet except for the ordinary sounds of the wild, an owl somewhere distant, the wind in the high pines, the small persistent life of the desert going about its business. "I want to tell you something," Vernon said. She waited. "When I came into Caldera Creek that first morning, and I saw you standing in the doorway of your store telling Harlan Prout what you expected him to do about the situation, I thought, that is someone worth knowing." He paused. "I did not know how right I was. I have been finding out every day since." Julia was quiet for a moment. The stars blazed above them. She thought about Missouri and Thomas Brenner and the grief of that loss, and about the carpetbag and the deed and the cracked, dry land she had arrived to, and the 3 years of building, and the floor pried up on October morning, and the road north through Raton Pass and the mountains white-tipped in the autumn, and a man rebuilding a fire in the dark so she would not wake to cold, and a proposal given with total honesty and no smoothness whatsoever, and a boy with amber eyes who tracked things around the house, and a small fierce girl who was currently terrorizing Mrs. Elmer with remarkable efficiency, and this canyon and these stars and this hand holding hers. "I want to tell you something too," she said. He waited. "I have been happy before, with Thomas, with my life in Missouri before everything changed. I have had real happiness and I do not discount it." She squeezed his hand. "But what I have now, what we have, is the specific kind of happiness that comes from knowing that you built it yourself, that it is entirely real, that the person beside you is beside you by genuine and unconditional choice. That kind is different from all the others." She paused. "I just want you to know that I know that." Vernon Underwood, who was not a man given to easy expression, pulled her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles in the firelight, and held it there for a long moment and said nothing, because nothing was needed. They rode back to Caldera Creek on the 5th day. Mrs. Elmer met them at the door of the mercantile with Clara on her hip and Thomas behind her, and Thomas ran to his father the way he always did, and Vernon caught him and swung him up, and the boy said, "Papa, I found a perfect arrowhead by the creek. I saved it to show you," with the urgency of genuine discovery, and Vernon said, "I want to see it immediately," and the look on his face as he said it was the same open, unguarded look that Julia had seen at the front of the church in February of 1883, the look with nothing held back. The year 1890 brought the New Mexico Territory the continued discussion of statehood that had been ongoing for years, and it brought Caldera Creek a new school teacher. A young woman named Miss Amanda Foote, fresh from a teacher's college in Missouri, and the school that had previously operated in seasonal fits and starts now ran a proper 5-day schedule, and Thomas, who had been sick since July, was enrolled on the first day with an expression of intense scientific interest that made his mother very hopeful and his father quietly proud. Clara, at 3, observed her brother's departure for school on the first morning with the expression of someone making notes for future reference, clearly already calculating how long until the same opportunity would be available to her. Vernon began teaching Thomas to track that same fall, in the evenings and on Sunday mornings, taking the boy out into the land behind the town and showing him what he had learned from old Ramiro years ago in East Texas. How to read ground disturbance, how to age a print, how to think through what an animal or a person was doing from the evidence of what they left behind. Thomas was a genuinely gifted student of this, his father's patience and his mother's precision operating together in a particularly useful combination. Julia watched the two of them come back from one of these sessions on a Sunday morning in October. The light golden and slanted, the first real cold of the season in the air, Vernon with his hand on Thomas's shoulder and Thomas explaining something with great animation, pointing back at the trail they had come along, and Vernon listening with complete attention, nodding, asking questions. She was standing in the back doorway of the mercantile home with a cup of coffee in both hands, and she watched them come toward her, and the feeling in her chest was so full and complete that it was almost more than a person could contain. Thomas ran the last 20 yards and arrived at her legs and said, "Mama, I tracked a jackrabbit all the way to its burrow under the mesquite. Papa says I have good instincts." And Julia handed Vernon his coffee over the boy's head and met his eyes, and they shared the look of two people who have built the same thing and know it equally and are equally glad. "He does," Vernon confirmed, accepting the coffee. "Exceptionally good instincts." Clara appeared in the doorway behind Julia, having heard the voices, and she looked at her father and said, "Can I come next time?" "When you are 5, Vernon said. "I am almost 5, Clara said. "You are 3, Thomas informed her. "Almost 5, Clara repeated and went back inside. Vernon looked at his wife. Julia was already smiling. "We are going to have our hands full with that one," he said. "We already do," she said happily. Inside, the coffee was hot, and the kitchen was warm, and Thomas had spread his findings from the morning on the kitchen table. A perfect jackrabbit print preserved in a piece of damp clay that he had apparently brought home as documentation. And Clara was examining it with the critical eye of someone who would decide independently whether it met the required standards. And Vernon sat down at the table and put his hands around the coffee Julia had given him, and looked around the kitchen of the home he had built with his own hands, at his children, at his wife moving back to the stove to check on the Sunday dinner, her dark red hair catching the light, the garnet ring on her finger that had been his mother's, and he thought about October of 1882, the stage with the busted wheel, the hotel window before sunrise, the man slipping out of the alley, the boot prints in the livery dirt, all of it. And he thought about how a trail, followed honestly and far enough, always comes to something. He had tracked that trail across 3 states. He had brought back $432, less $34 spent on a train ticket and 2 nights at a hotel, and the drinks a thief thought would steady his nerve. He had brought back the full amount of her material loss, in the professional and technical sense. But what he had brought back, what he had actually recovered across 3 states of high desert and mountain pass and cold morning and firelight conversation, was considerably more than had been lost. She had lost money. He had brought back that money. And in the bringing, in the riding and the tracking and the slow, steady accumulation of knowing each other across the miles, he had also brought back something that Julia Brenner had not known was lost. She had not known, in the long 3 years of building alone, that she had slowly and quietly made peace with solitude in the way that people sometimes make peace with things they are actually waiting to be done with. She had not known she was waiting. Vernon had not known he was looking for a home. It turned out the trail, followed honestly and far enough, had led them both there. Clara turned 5 in the fall of 1891 and held Vernon to his word about the tracking lessons with the firmness that characterized everything she did. And on her 5th birthday, after the small celebration in the kitchen with the cake Julia had made and the gifts that included a book about western birds and a small compass that Vernon had engraved with her initials, Clara put on her boots and said to her father, "Now we go tracking." Thomas, who was 7 and regarded himself as the senior student, tried to explain that there was a particular order to the lessons. Clara looked at him with an expression that Julia recognized from her own mirror. "I will learn the order," Clara said, "while we are out there." And she walked to the back door and put her hand on the latch and looked back at Vernon. He stood up from the table and reached for his hat. He looked at Julia, who was watching with her arms folded and her amber eyes bright with something that was mostly love and partly laughter. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. He put on his hat, and Thomas ran to get his own, and Clara opened the back door, and the three of them walked out into the bright New Mexico morning. His serious boy, his fierce girl, and himself, and the door swung closed behind them. Julia stood in the kitchen of the home they had made and looked around it. The cast-iron stove, and the shelves of preserved food, and the table scarred with years of use, and the bird book left open from the birthday, and the children's boots usually piled by the door now absent because they were wearing them. And she heard, through the back wall, the sound of Vernon's voice and Clara's higher, insistent one, and Thomas's explanatory tones, and the sound of boots in the dry earth behind the building, and she thought, "This is the full account. This is every dollar and then some." She put on her apron and went to open the mercantile for the morning, which was what she did every morning, and the bell above the door rang as the first customer of the day came in from the bright October street, and Caldera Creek was itself around her, dusty and permanent and entirely hers, and the sun came through the windows and lay golden on the wooden floor, and the day began. Outside, in the clear, dry air behind the mercantile, Vernon crouched beside a print in the soft earth and showed Clara with his finger the direction and depth of it. And she crouched beside him with her small face perfectly serious and her compass held carefully in both hands. And Thomas stood over them both with the proprietary air of a senior student. And a jackrabbit went about its jackrabbit business in the mesquite 20 yards away, entirely unaware of being the subject of this generation's first lesson, and the blue New Mexico sky arched above all of them, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, the way it always had been and always would be, and the trail went forward from here.